Live. Hello there! It's Tuesday, which means it's another time for a English Language Club Hangout. My name is Colin Munro, and I'm joined by Tony. Hello, Tony. How are you?
Glad to be here.
Great. So we've got a few people watching already. Lolly Lolly, Susanta, Shahifur. Hello, I haven't seen you before, so you're very welcome. So, Tony, you were just saying, you were saying a minute ago what we were talking about. So, last week we had a very interesting question. I think it was
a series
from
of questions.
Yeah. I think it was from Lolly Lolly.
I think Lolly Lolly started, and then there was a discussion from several different people, and we didn't have time to kind of address it.
Yeah.
And so we were just talking before we started that we should start off by answering this question that we didn't get to from last week.
Which was?
And then here I just see in the chat Lolly Lolly, who I think is the person who brought it up originally last week, is asking a very similar question. The question from last week is it good to learn English from many different teachers with different accents? So for instance, if some of you're watching YouTube videos from British English teachers or American English teachers or Canadian or Australian or whatever, is that a good thing because you're getting a variety of different accents exposure, or is it extra difficult because instead of focusing in on one accent, you're kind of learning a lot of different things? What do you think about that, Colin?
Well, yeah, that is a really interesting question, and I'm not 100% sure what my opinion is. Ultimately, I suppose people learning English as a second language should be focused on, getting as wide a vocabulary as possible, learning the proper grammatical structure in order to communicate effectively.
Yes.
Should be the number one priority. Now, obviously,
absolutely.
Yeah, and then part of that is pronunciation as well.
Yes.
But having correct pronunciation doesn't necessarily mean you're speaking in an English accent or an American accent. So
or a specific one of those.
Any specific accent. You can speak with correct pronunciation and be communicating effectively with your own foreign accent. And there's nothing, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with that. I like to look at English as an international language. I think that's why, it is an international language, and I think that's why it's useful. And when we start trying to sound English or sound American, I don't know why do you want to do that? I don't understand why people want to do that unless they're an actor or something like that, and they want to, then get into certain aspects of phonetics a little bit deeper and things. But for the most part, I think the English Language Club exists to teach English as an international language. So not specifically British English, not specifically American English, but as an international language, so that we can all communicate effectively in business and in science and in whatever field we're in.
Yes.
That's my view, I suppose.
And the thing about it is, those core ideas of grammar and pronunciation are the same in it, no matter what teacher you're listening to, no matter what kind of English they speak, it's going to be the same. The grammar works the same way. What you'll see is sometimes you'll see a difference in grammar, at least, between a kind of an old school, really formal way of speaking and a more alive, more modern, natural way of speaking. But the grammar rules aren't really different. And oftentimes we think, we're told even, that the pronunciation is so different. That really isn't as true as you think. The only major pronunciation difference between British and American or Canadian English is the way the R is pronounced. And that isn't as hard and fast a rule as people think. Hard and fast, that's one of those idioms we were talking about. It's not a real rule. Because there are places in the United States where they pronounce their R's that way. Most famously Boston, but also the Southern accent. There's actually millions of people in the U.S. that pronounce the R the way British do. And there are places, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but there are British accents, like local accents, where they don't pronounce the R that way. So other than that one with the R, you kind of have to know, do you pronounce it ka or car? That's one, and we think a lot about that, but that's just one little exception. Peel back the layers, and the way British people pronounce words, and the way American or Canadian or New Zealand pronounce the words, it's the same, because the way those sounds are pronounced, even with the R, there is an R sound that is pronounced in British, and so all of the sounds that exist are the same. Just the way we say certain words is different, and that's accent, not pronunciation.
Yes, because there is, so in phonetics, we have the 44 different sounds, which are represented by the symbols in the phonetic alphabet, which I'll just bring up briefly. Each one of those is a sound, but then there is variation within those, within how each one of those can be pronounced. So I think the term is allophones are all the different ways you can correctly pronounce each phoneme. So yeah, there is a lot of variation, and there are different accents, and I think it's absolutely fine to speak English with a slightly French accent.
Absolutely.
And I think if you're French or if you're Brazilian, it shouldn't be your goal to speak English with an English accent or an American accent, unless you're actually an actor or something, like I said.
Right. And that's a different thing. Like learning for acting purposes, learning to use an accent in an effective way is actually a very different process than learning to speak a language for the first time. And it's actually more akin to learning to sing than it is to learning to speak a language, because it's all about
they do a lot of physical exercises and things. But I do say that pronunciation, trying to improve your pronunciation, is always a physical thing. So there is some overlap there. But,
I mean the process, the resources that you're going to use as an actor are very different, and the way they're going to approach the pronunciation, because they're keying in on small differences that don't actually matter when you're speaking to someone, but do matter more in something like on stage and stuff like that. But that said, I know a lot of people really want to have the right accent. When they go to a place, they want to have the right accent, or if they live somewhere. I don't know if this is something that is spoken about all over the world, or if it's the same word that's used, but a lot of people want to pass, they say. So passing is
pass for an American, or pass for
Yes. It's where when people hear you talk, they think that you are a native speaker. And a lot of people want this, especially if you've lived in a place for a long time. And a lot of people say, well, it must be about accent. And so the way I improve the way people are going to treat me, or the way what they're going to think of me, is by improving my accent. And sometimes that's true, but it is not as true as you might think. In fact, so for instance, especially if we're talking about not like, okay, say someone has a Brazilian accent or a French accent, and they want to speak English with a completely American accent so that people think that they are American. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. But if you're coming to the United States and you want to speak with either an American accent so that people will think that you learned American English, as opposed to a British accent, don't worry about that. For the most part, if you're speaking to someone who has an American accent, the British accent is going to sound exotic and wonderful and interesting. And I don't know, I can't speak to whether the same is true in Britain, maybe not. But
in a way, yeah.
Yeah, and so you don't have to worry about it. Also, someone who speaks English with a French accent or with a Spanish accent is going to sound interesting and engaging to a native speaker. So people actually like hearing other accents. What people have a hard time with is when they can't understand someone because they're not pronouncing things well.
Yeah.
So that's the difference.
And
Like
it's two
what
separate things.
accent you have? Yeah, exactly. Those are separate things. Pronunciation and accent are separate things. So what accent you have is more often than not going to make people interested. But the key is pronouncing things well so that people can understand you. And that's actually a big part of what this whole Inside English idea is kind of taking, from being able to get along in English to actually having an advanced level of English, beginning to sound like a native speaker, not in your accent. And Inside English isn't really about pronunciation, though, so many things that the English Language Club has produced over the years are about English pronunciation. But Inside English is about grammar, because that's actually another key way that you are going to kind of be comfortable, and people are going to be comfortable talking to you in either the United States or England or Scotland or New Zealand or anywhere, is if your grammar is clear, so that people don't have to spend a lot of extra effort trying to understand what you mean. And that's where I think that the emphasis should go. Like, whether you're, if you're listening to YouTube videos by American speakers or British speakers, you're learning the same grammar, you're learning the same pronunciation rules, and that is what's really important.
Yeah, I think that's far more important than trying to reduce your accent. Is using the right tense in a sentence is going to, if you use the wrong tense in a sentence, you're going to sound far more strange than having some kind of an accent.
Absolutely. And it's harder to pick up on. It's harder to realize, I'm not using the present continuous to talk about the future the way other people are. Those kind of things are a lot harder to pick up on, a lot harder to realize the mistakes you're making, which is, again, why we are working so hard on this Inside English course, to kind of help you peel back the layers and figure out, how you should be using these different tenses.
Yeah. Great. Well, I really hope that's helpful. We sort of jumped into that very, very quickly. We didn't have a chance to say, get your questions coming in as always, because that's what we're here for. We're here to answer your questions. So, and if you've got any comments on what we've been saying so far about accent, what's your opinion? Do you feel you have an accent? Do you feel that your accent is stopping you from being understood? Let us know. We'd really love to know what you think in the comments. And as always, if you've got any other questions for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be here to answer as many of them as we can.
Yes.
Yes. Hello to everyone who I see. Gaspar's joined us. Hello, Gaspar. We've got Vu Thea. He says hello. And we've got some questions now. So Susanna says, why does bottle up mean hide? I can't understand how this phrasal verb is created in relation to its literal meaning.
That's actually an interesting one. Also, I love that you called that out as a phrasal verb, right? It's not necessarily an idiom. I mean, I think it is idiomatic, but it is a phrasal verb. It's what it means is actually quite literal. The verb to bottle means to put something in a bottle. It's that simple, right? So when you bottle something up, it doesn't always mean to hide it. For instance, if you're making some kind of a drink and you put it in a bottle, you're not putting it in a bottle so that nobody can see it, so that nobody knows it's there. You're putting it in a bottle so it doesn't splash around and get everywhere.
So
it's hard to drink a beverage. Yeah, to contain it. To contain it.
Right.
So bottling something up means keeping it inside. Keeping it from going everywhere. So you can bottle up your anger. Bottling up your anger means you keep it inside instead of being angry at everybody around you, right? Yeah. So hide, yes, it does mean hide, like hide your emotions. Sometimes bottling it up means you don't let everyone around you know you're angry, but not always. I mean, people can tell you're angry, but you're not like lashing out at people.
Yeah. So you're saying that it doesn't really mean to hide it so much. It's more about that you're controlling it.
Right. It
So
can mean, you can use it to mean you're hiding your emotions, so nobody knows that
yeah.
you're angry, or if you're bottling up your sadness or whatever. You can hide it, but that's not what the verb means at its core. It means to contain, to
Yeah.
control, to keep it inside.
So
And the reason that that's a phrasal verb, you can use bottle up in almost the same way that you would use bottle. Like, for instance, I make kombucha, or we make kombucha and we bottle it. We put it in bottles. Um, you could say, well, I'm bottling up our kombucha. There's nothing wrong with that. That's bottle up can mean the same as bottle.
yeah.
But we use the phrasal verb bottle up very often with things like our thoughts, our emotions,
So when
and our
when it's
feelings.
figurative or metaphorical,
And not
then
always. Again, you
yeah.
can say, that they're bottling their emotions. And again, it's not, but it's more common to use bottle up with figurative and just bottle when it's not figurative. And the reason why this is a phrasal verb is, again, a lot of prepositions just go well with certain verbs. They've just, maybe they sound good. It doesn't necessarily mean that it means anything. Like, it's not like when you bottle something that there's anything up to do with it.
No.
So sometimes it's just that they sound nice together.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean,
oftentimes you'll find a verb paired with a specific preposition, and that's what's happening here.
So do you think that bottle up also has something to do with the fact that, like, sometimes with a champagne, like a bottle of champagne, it can kind of explode, and if you bottle up your emotions too much,
Eventually they will
eventually
explode.
it will explode.
Absolutely.
I
That's
guess
definitely
there's
part of the.
another
Yeah.
layer to it like that.
Yes. And it is a very interesting idiom and phrasal verb, isn't it? The bottling something up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Susansa. Any more questions like that about idioms, pronunciation, grammar, anything? Keep them coming in. We've got another comment here on what we were talking about earlier from Fiorella. She says, "Hello. I don't think I have a strong accent, but I must admit I struggle with the pronunciation of vowel sounds since my native language is Spanish. This doesn't stop me from being understood, though." Yeah. So, in Spanish, obviously the vowels are pronounced a lot more consistently with how they're
For sure.
spelled. So I guess in English we probably use more vowel sounds.
More different sounds, yes.
Yeah,
And
so,
more variety. It's harder to predict which vowel sound you use in any given case. Yeah.
yeah, or which or how you should say the letter A, for example.
Yes, exactly. It has several different ways you might, about, father, apple. They're all, pronounced slightly differently, right? And this is a thing, some people have, depending usually, like Fioria is saying, like what language they're coming from. Some people will have more trouble pronouncing vowels. Other people will have more trouble pronouncing consonants. Some people will have trouble only with specific consonants or specific vowels. And there's also the question of how much does our pronunciation prevent us from being understood?
Yeah.
And that's a really tricky one. A lot of the time, it depends on who you're talking to. People who are more used to speaking to foreigners are obviously going to be better at picking up on what you understand. If you talk to people who don't have a lot of experience speaking to foreigners, sometimes even very small changes will make it so that they can't really understand. And it also depends on what the mistake is. There are obviously words where a slight pronunciation difference will mean a completely different word, right? And so, it's a tough one. And it's good though, Farah, that you're realizing there's a separation between your accent and your pronunciation.
Yeah,
that you don't necessarily have to have a strong accent to need help on your pronunciation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's good that you're saying, despite the fact that you've got some trouble with the vowel sounds, you're saying that you don't have a strong accent yet, but you don't find it stops you from being understood. So yeah, I mean that at the end of the day, that's the important thing, isn't it? We all just
really
want to be understood.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And in some ways, I think the grammar thing is much more important than the pronunciation thing when it comes to being understood. At least, if you're at a basic level, they're both very important. But the more you're trying to improve your English, grammar becomes quite important because there comes a point where your pronunciation doesn't have to be perfect and everyone's going to understand you. But there are situations where even if your pronunciation or even if your grammar is understandable, it's going to be off. And there might be no way that you can know that without really studying the grammar rules. The example that kind of keeps coming up is, we use the present continuous to talk about the future, maybe more often than we do use the future tenses to talk about the future. You say I am meeting you tomorrow in more often than we'd say I will meet you tomorrow sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And so that one that's quite tricky. Can be quite tricky.
So Mr. Ecuador has a very interesting question. He says, I hope the question is not rude. What do you think of Queen Elizabeth's grammar skills? I'm convinced that she speaks excellent, but can you hear mistakes from time to time? Well, I can't think of I can't think of a time when I've sat down and listened to her speaking and thought, oh, she's making a mistake, So I don't think she makes lots of mistakes. Having said that, though, she does speak in a way that is very particular.
Yes.
To her being the Queen and being very posh and, of the fact that she's royalty.
You wouldn't necessarily want to model your speaking on her speaking,
no.
But that doesn't mean she's making a mistake, right?
No.
I mean, I will say she has much better English than a lot of world leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. And she probably uses a lot of words that are not that most people wouldn't. I wouldn't encourage most people using. It only sort of works because it's her. Yeah, but I don't think she's making mistakes. It's just it's a particular style, and like what we were saying, there's American English, British English, there's different accents, and she's got a very particular type of British accent. There's lots of British accents, there's lots of American accents, and it's not wrong. It's not. There's a difference. So this again, that reinforces what we were saying about how there's speaking incorrectly and speaking with an accent, and it's two different things. You can have a strong accent even if it's not an English one or an American one, and you're still speaking correctly.
Yes.
So yeah.
And there's other dimensions to this as well. The Queen will speak, as a general rule, a very formal mode of English. And some of this is because it's older. Like, obviously, she's been around a lot longer than most of us. And so the English that she grew up speaking is a little bit different from the English that most people now are growing up speaking. But also, when she speaks, when she's talking to her family members, I don't know how she speaks, but when she's giving a speech, obviously, that's a very formal situation. And we do use different language, different ways, different constructions when we're speaking formally. And this is something that I think comes up a lot, actually, with learning English, is a lot of textbooks, a lot of English teachers, especially part of an older tradition, advocate a very formal way of speaking English. We talked about this a few weeks ago, the difference between who and whom. And that's an example where in very formal English, people are expected to use whom instead of who when they're using the object of a sentence. You are speaking to whom is just really formal. But that's not how people speak on a day-to-day basis. So again, you have to be aware of this difference between really, really formal English and normal everyday English. And formal English is kind of, it's not disappearing, but it's losing ground. It used to be, for instance, that when I was in school, I was taught when you write an email, you use formal English to write an email. because you're supposed to use formal English in letters.
Yeah.
And emails are just like letters.
Well, they used to be.
Nowadays,
Yeah.
this would be a terrible idea. Obviously, an email is not super formal. An email is very casual. And so the number of, or the different places where we use formal English is kind of getting smaller. That said, if you're listening to a speech from the Queen, it's a formal situation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure the Queen sounds very different when she's at home talking to Prince Philip. You know,
or the dogs.
Or the dogs, yeah. But we don't get to see that very often.
Exactly.
So, if at all. So yeah, I think so there's the fact that she's being very formal, because we only get to see her in formal situations. And then she obviously has a different, she's quite old, so her language is a little antiquated just because of that. She's also from a particular class, so that influences it as well. But also a lot of that is, I think, probably part of an act. She's not being her. I doubt she's being her true self when we see her giving the Queen speech at Christmas time. You know, she knows that she has to project a certain image, which may not be her true personality.
Right.
You know, so yeah.
Now, speaking of that, Jorge Lopez just asked a question, and so maybe we could talk about this for a bit. So people could, we were just talking about British pronunciation and whether it's important stuff, so maybe you can talk a little bit about RP. Jorge says, I think Queen Elizabeth speaks what is called received pronunciation, according to the linguist David Crystal or Gerald Kelly. Right? And so this is an interesting one. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about the difference between RP, received pronunciation, and posh, and what you think about that as kind of a goal of how to speak. Like if one is trying to speak as proper British English as one can.
Yeah. So look, first of all, I'm not a linguist. I'm not an expert on these things. But as I understand it, though, RP is much broader than just how the Queen speaks. You can be speaking RP, received pronunciation, and not be sounding like the Queen. And I think, in actual fact, my accent, I think, is quite close to RP. But I don't sound like the Queen at all. In
fact, I'm not sure the Queen is officially supposed to be speaking in RP. No,
I think RP as well is what a lot of like BBC news readers and things aim for. But I think RP is more. It's like taking the phonetic chart and just sort of trying to find the most clear version of each of those sounds and speaking in that way. So avoiding the sort of way that we drop our T's and we speak better instead of better. Things like that. So pronouncing those things clearly. I think that's how I interpret received pronunciation. But yeah, it does get confused, I think, with sounding posh. But I don't think it necessarily is the case.
In fact, they're quite different. If you hear the way they sound, some of the pronunciation, like I think what people are sometimes confused about is that RP is not so much like a regional accent or a naturally evolved accent as it is a taught way of speaking that is considered best. So nobody has as their kind of natural accent necessarily RP, or at least it didn't used to be the case. Colin has talked in the past about how you have intentionally chosen to speak as close to RP as possible as a English teacher, and
it's not exactly intentionally, but I have as soon as I started teaching English, I started to realize the ways in which I was not easy to understand to people learning English. So yeah, my voice has evolved, has changed a little bit since then as a result of that. But it's not so much that I'm aiming for RP. It's more that I've just started to avoid certain things and speak more clearly in order to be understood. So my goal's never been RP. My goal has been
As a goal,
be
right,
understood
yeah, exactly.
by people who have English as a second language.
And that is in many ways the goal of what RP exists to do, is to try to be as clear and clean as possible. Now, mandolin. This is really interesting. Several people are asking some interesting questions. First, hi Israk, nice to see you. Mandolin Wu is saying that says, I have heard that RP is considered posh. How do people accept it in the UK? Lolly also asks, what is the difference between an RP accent and a posh accent? So can you address those for us?
Yeah, and it's strange. I mean, in the UK, I can't imagine anyone saying, "Well, that person speaks RP."
Right.
You know, but they might say, "Oh, that person speaks very posh."
Right.
And so, how do people accept it? Well, some people don't like posh people.
Yeah.
Some people are very, very against posh people. But I don't know. There's so many different accents in the UK. So many different types of people. And in my, I probably talk and meet more people who have English as a second language than I do English as a first language, but that's probably because of my line of work and things. So, but yeah, I know other teachers as well who've had the similar kind of thing, and in some cases they've had very very strong regional accents, and they've changed the way they speak in order to be understood more by their students, and just people who have English as a second language in general. So yeah, the question, how do people accept it? It's not an issue at all. It's not something I've ever thought about. I don't think many people think about it at all.
I think something that a lot of people who don't have a lot of familiarity with the way British English actually works is a lot of, especially for instance, a lot of Americans or people that are learning English will hear about British accents, and they'll hear about posh and Cockney, and thanks to some successful television shows, a lot of people now know the Northern accent, or they'll know a Scottish accent or whatever. But what people don't realize is there are dozens of different British accents, and so there's so many different ones, and a lot of people will immediately pick up on where you're from based on how you speak British English. But as someone who is learning British English, or just learning English and you're going to be speaking to British people, your goal is to be as well understood as possible, to have as clear, understandable pronunciation as you can. Now, if that means that what you're learning and you're listening to and trying to practice is received pronunciation, that's fine. Nobody is then going to, you're not going to show up and people think, well, that person is speaking RP, how posh. And of course I didn't say that in a British accent, but they're just going to be able to understand you more clearly.
Yeah.
Unless you're an actor, you're not going to try to emulate a Northern accent or a Scottish accent. Like that's just,
you definitely, if you're learning English as a second language, the model you aim for definitely shouldn't be a regional accent like Bristolian or Scottish or you should definitely, I think RP is kind of a very neutral accent, and it's a good one to aim for, because like I said, it is taking all those phonemes and just trying to use the clearest version of them.
Yes. Now, if just to bring that to American English for anyone who's interested, the equivalent is called the Midwest accent. In American English. And the interesting thing is, it's not, nobody decided we should teach everybody the Midwest accent because it's the clearest to understand. It wasn't picked. It has just kind of by consensus, people see this is the clearest and most typical American accent. And so this is the accent that news anchors or people on documentaries are picked for, because it's an accent that's not going to offend anyone's sensibilities no matter what regional American accent they have, because there are just as many regional American accents as there are British.
Well, probably more, in fact.
Spread out. I'm not sure if there are more, but they're certainly spread out over more. You don't get the same this neighborhood accent that you as much as you do in British English. So like again, a Bostonian accent or a Southern drawl or a Chicago accent. These are all very, very distinctive and very different, and obviously that's not what you're shooting for. No. Hopefully no one is out there trying to learn English with a New Yorker accent, Queen's accent, or something like that. Most of the time when you're learning an American English, you're actually learning the Midwest accent. And I think this just goes to show there is no such thing as not having an accent, even when you're learning a new language. There's a bit of a joke when my wife and I were in South America learning Spanish. One of the main people that we were learning from was Argentine. And when we would travel around South America, people would tell us we have an Argentine accent in our Spanish. Well, I mean, really, we have an English accent. But it just goes to show you can't learn a language without picking up some kind of regional accent. And that's not something to worry about. You just go for clarity. If you're looking in books and you're saying, okay, well, what accent should I be trying to learn for maximum clarity? Well, in British, it's probably RP. In American English, it's probably Midwestern. And you just have to go with that. But your goal is not to learn that accent. Your goal is just to speak clearly.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks everyone for your comments so far. Keep them coming in though, because we've got to the end of the comments, and it would be great to talk to hear from you some more and get into some other subjects. Yes. We've got 15 people watching. That's great. We've got 10 likes so far. So if you are watching, click that like button. It really does help. And let us know what else you want us to talk about. We've just got a comment from Jorge. He says, changing the topic, what about the intentionally purpose of the accent on the program Modern Family? I like it a lot because it tries to place the Latin American English accent more international. Are you familiar with Modern Family?
I know of the show. I haven't seen it, so I can't speak to this. I do know that in a lot of American programs, Latin American English has become very popular for a couple of reasons. One being obviously Hollywood, the place in the U.S. that's famous for making movies and this sort of thing, is in Southern California. It's quite close to Mexico, and there are a lot of Latin Spanish-speaking people who are also speaking English, and obviously are becoming actors and producers and filmmakers and the like.
But also the audience that they're kind of writing for.
Well, also, I mean, there's just a huge number of Spanish first language, English second language, or third language, or fourth language people in the U.S. So yes, I think you see this a lot more. It is probably the most commonly represented kind of second accent in U.S. I mean, I don't actually know whether this program is a U.S. television program.
Yeah, it's a U.S. show, and there's one character. There's one character who's from, I think she's from Colombia, and she's married to a American. So I think the actress is actually from Colombia, I think, but the question I think what Jorge is getting at is, do they play up her accent and make it a caricature of the accent? I think maybe they do to an extent, but they've got to do that at the same time as her being properly understood. She can't. She has to be understood. So that's a great example of how you can sort of have a strong accent but still be pronouncing correctly and being understood correctly.
And again, most people, they respond to that accent as being interesting and exotic and fascinating. It's a beautiful accent. So, for instance, to all of you out there who speak Latin American Spanish, don't be afraid of your accent. Like, work on your pronunciation so that it's clear. But it's not that your accent is going to be horrible to an American, for instance, that you should be speaking with an American accent. Well, no. As a general rule, it's a very nice accent to have, as long as you're speaking clearly so that people can understand you. There's no barrier to that. It's a really beautiful accent.
I think your accent is kind of part of your national identity, and I don't think that your national identity is ever something you should be ashamed of. And it's exactly the same with accent.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. So are there any other TV shows that people have found useful for learning English? Let us know in the comments. You were alluding to one earlier on. I don't know. You said people in the north. Are you talking about Game of Thrones or?
Yes.
Right. But because you see, watching Game of Thrones, I don't hear any accent that's like very strong Northern. I mean, yes,
there was one, Rose Leslie. Is it Rose Leslie that had the very strong Northern accent? There was one actress who was quite famous for a little bit as having a really strong Northern accent.
Well, Rose Leslie in real life does not have a very strong. She's actually from Scotland, but she speaks like the Queen in real life.
So it may have been a different. There was one. I don't remember which one it was.
But no, it's interesting. Yeah. No, but her accent in the show is very Northern.
Okay,
but she's actually from Scotland, but she's from her family are like super rich and they live in a castle in Scotland. Her proper accent is
quite posh.
Is quite posh. It's very interesting. If you just find footage of her speaking in an interview or something, it's interesting to see her because she has such a different accent. I mean, there are lots of accents in Game of Thrones because that's part of what Game of Thrones is all about. The kind of
so it's interesting to hear the different British accents there, or Scottish and Irish and others, So this is actually, I mean, a lot of television and movies nowadays really try to be more multinational, and one of the ways to do that is with accents. Now, the irony is a lot of times these are fake. For instance, a lot of Latin American actors or actresses in American movies or television actually use a much stronger accent in their acting than they have in real life. And again, it's just because they're playing it up. Again, acting and accents in acting are not exactly the same as having an accent for everyday use. The way they train it and the way they're taught to speak is very specific and sometimes different. And so it's not necessarily a really good example, but it is really interesting to be able to hear people with lots of different accents, though unless you really know that accent, you don't know whether it's very realistically done or not.
Yeah. Now,
Fiorella pointed out, and this is actually a very serious issue, and I'm glad that we can talk about this. Fiorella is saying the problem here is that people are bullied for having a thick accent, even by people that are not native English speakers. And so there's actually two issues here. One is the kind of a question, if you go to the United States or Britain, will you be bullied or will you be treated negatively for having a strong accent? And there's a second question of what do you do about people who speak your own language who tell you that your English is not good enough, right? That's an interesting one. And the first is obviously, yes, there are people who are prejudiced against anybody who doesn't speak their language. Sometimes they have a reason for it. Sometimes it's just because they feel uncomfortable or they don't deal with foreigners very often, so they don't know how to talk to them. However, I think part of the problem with any bully is a bully is going to find a reason to be mean regardless. And there are bullies out there. They're not usually the majority, though. Most people that I have known that have a problem with people's accents, it's because they have a hard time understanding them. and that's actually not an accent thing. That's actually pronunciation and grammar. And so being a foreigner in a foreign country is always tough. Like I've lived, most of my adult life in one foreign country or another, and it can be tough. Whether you speak the language well or not well, or how you dress or what you eat or what you look like, different things can give you away as a foreigner, and then different people will treat you in different ways based on how they feel about foreigners. But as it comes to your accent, the biggest issue is not your accent, it's your pronunciation and your grammar. If you can speak clearly and speak using grammar that people understand, and they don't have to like think about and figure out what does it mean, that response is not going to stop people. Like the fact that you have an accent, as long as you're understandable, is not by itself going to stop people from. It's not going to change the way people feel about you. The fact that you're a foreigner, there's nothing you can do about that. But when it comes to your accent,
nor should there be. I mean, there's
understood. That some people are not, or some people don't like foreigners for whatever reason.
Well, but that's their problem, not yours. I mean,
exactly. So again, when it comes to actually coming to the United States and speaking to an American, or coming to Canada or Australia or Britain, don't worry so much about your whether your accent is strong as whether you're very clear to understand. Because again, most people just find it very interesting, whether they even realize it or not, to hear people with different accents. But people again get frustrated when they have a hard time understanding people, and that makes it harder for people to kind of meet you on your own terms.
Also, I think if you're learning English and you live in another country, wherever, South America or Asia or the Middle East or wherever, and you've never been to the UK before, you might have seen a lot of movies and TV shows, things like Harry Potter and Downton Abbey, and you might develop from that a perception of how everyone is in England. And when you come, you will realize that it's not like that at all. England is a very, very multicultural country. Not just in like London and things. I live in the west of England, near a city called Bristol, and like I said, I probably meet more people who are from other European countries, and not even European countries, other countries. Yes. Probably 60-40 percentage is so 60% not from the UK. So yeah, it's a very multicultural country, and everybody is accustomed to dealing with people from other nationalities. It's I do think it was the same for me. Like I went to visit my parents briefly lived in Miami, so I went to visit Miami, and I had a vague idea of what Miami would be like based on movies and things. What I didn't expect is that the English is like a second language in Miami.
In Miami, for sure.
Officially, English in America is the first language.
It's the common language.
The common
There's
language.
No official language.
Right. Yeah. But that's not the case in Miami. In Miami, no. English is very much a second language.
Especially for advertising, like all the signs are in Spanish. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and again, I grew up in Florida, but I grew up in a very different part of Florida from Miami. So even Florida, which is a relatively small and contained area, there's dramatically different parts of it. And so you can visit Florida and only ever speak to people in Haitian Creole, because you go to a community where that's what most people speak, or you could go to Florida and mostly speak to people in Spanish. But yeah, Florida is a really good example as well of a place where people are very used to foreigners, or hearing people with all sorts of different accents. Another good example is Canada, where I am. It's very multicultural. People are very used to hearing different accents and that kind of thing.
So Ishrek's got a question. He says, "Sir, have you tried to learn Arabic, or what do you know about it?" I have to confess, I know very little about Arabic. Tony, do you know
I
much?
I know a little bit of Arabic. I know Aramaic a bit. I studied it in university, which is kind of the it is a modern language. It's also the precursor to Arabic. Arabic came out of that language.
Hmm.
So I know quite a bit about it, but I don't speak it. With a little practice, I can say a few things, but I don't quite speak it.
Right. So yeah, interesting question. So why? I'd love to know why you're asking that, and what is it? What do you think are the issues that people from Arabic backgrounds have? What do you find difficult in learning English, or are there any sounds that you find difficult to pronounce because maybe in English you're not accustomed to using those sounds in
Mhm.
Arabic? I'd love to know a little bit more about why
Yeah.
you're asking that question.
So I did teach English. I was the English teacher at an Islamic school for 2 years. So I do have quite a bit of experience with the other way around of working with Arabic
Mm.
speakers learning English. And yeah, there are some very
Oh right.
interesting challenges. We talked about the glottal stop. Uh-oh, right? In English,
Mm.
that is so hard for English speakers to kind of get their head around because it's so rare in English
Mm.
is a major part of Arabic and some other Middle Eastern languages to the
Mm.
point where it's used in a lot of names. So a lot of, and this is actually something that's interesting. Speaking of, how your accent is, a lot of people. So, for instance, if you have a glottal stop in your name, ahlam, for instance, uh, any English speaker is probably going to have a really hard time with your name to pronounce it. And this is an example. This isn't really about accent. It's about pronunciation. That sound just doesn't really exist in English. Again, we say it. Like the only example I can think of really is uh-oh. Like
Mm.
we say it sometimes, but we don't use it in words, and we don't know how to pronounce it as part of something. I mean, I do. I've studied those languages, but most English speakers just can't really
Yeah.
do it.
But I
And the
think
same thing happens.
part of it's almost like embarrassment because it's a sound that they're just not accustomed to saying,
Exactly.
um, and maybe it feels when you start to try and say those sounds, it almost feels like you're mocking the language. And you
Yes.
and that
Yes.
and if you probably don't want to mock the language, you're not that's not your intention, and that's why it sort of feels uncomfortable to do that. But actually,
Yes.
you're just making the sound, that you need to make. And I think the same is
Exactly.
true in English with certain sounds that people don't use in other languages, like
Yes.
they're not accustomed to sticking their tongue out,
Right.
so if they
In some.
do that, they might feel like they're mocking English. But actually,
Right.
no, you're not mocking it. That's just what you got to
Just
do to
saying
sound
correct.
correct, to pronounce
Yes, and
correctly.
in some languages or in some cultures, to stick your tongue out while you're talking is very, very rude. Another example. So Israq is asking about how what's difficult about learning Arabic for foreigners. Another one is the het sounds. In English, most people when they don't want to make a deep throaty sound
Mm,
because I mean honestly to an English to a lot of English speaking people it sounds like it sounds gross maybe even to them,
mm,
like they're not used to using that in talking, and so again they're going to feel a little self-conscious about trying to pronounce those words. So what you wind up getting is hear people just skipping those sounds
yeah.
when they're pronouncing those words, either because they don't want to try it and get it wrong, or they don't want to sound like they're mocking, or they don't want to sound like they're rude, even though it's not rude in that language. And so yeah, it's really quite challenging, and I've seen that with names more than anything else. Honestly, I don't know that many English speakers who have tried to learn Arabic. And when I learned Aramaic and some other languages, not very many people were interested in that. Uh, Ironically, I've heard a lot of people speaking really, really bad Hebrew. They try to speak it and they do a terrible, terrible job sometimes. So it's a really interesting one. And yes, Israq is bringing up the letters. This one is really interesting. Arabic letters, and the same as in many other languages. So many languages, Indo-European languages, use the Latin alphabet.
Yeah.
In everything from kind of Romanian to French, Icelandic, and that's the one that's used in English. And so a lot of, especially people of European descent, get really kind of zoned in on the alphabet and get really freaked out when they see anything that's not of the Roman alphabet. When I was very young, I was actually really fascinated with other alphabets. And so I learned the Greek alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet. And so I've always kind of had a fascination with learning other alphabets. So I've never really had a problem with the Arabic alphabet, for instance. I can usually sound out a word. So for instance, like if I'm watching the news, I can usually read the signs, for instance. In Aramaic or Arabic or Hebrew, they all have very similar sounds. The letters are just different, for instance, in Hebrew. But yeah, that's a really strong factor that makes it intimidating for a lot of English speakers to learn any of those languages. And the same for, say, for instance, Chinese. I lived in China for a bit, and I really only know like a half dozen characters. It's just not. I've never been able to really take the time to learn to read the characters.
Right. Okay, so Jorge says, is accent the same as dialect, such as, for example, Australian English, British, American, Canadian? Which are the major English variations? But what about Mexican or Chinese accent? So yeah, what is the difference between accent and language and dialects?
Accent is actually a lot like idiom. It's just kind of the way you say things. Accent can involve words, partner, mate. It can include pronunciation, like the difference between car and ka, airplane and aeroplane. It can, so that would be like spelling pronunciation as opposed to pronunciation of sounds. It can include things like, which contractions you use, all sorts of things. And so that's it's just accent is very broad. It's not only dialect either, because, for instance, within American English, if you get a native Bostonian, someone from Brooklyn, and someone from Georgia, and you have them all try to give a lesson on pronunciation, they're going to say things wildly differently, but they don't have different dialects necessarily. They might, in some cases, but the accent is separate from that.
So what about...
So a dialect has an accent, but local areas can have accents. Other languages can have accents, so there is such thing as a Spanish or a Latin American accent. Yeah. But also, you can combine those. So, for instance, you can have a Colombian accent, which is not the same as a Uruguayan accent, even though both of those speak the same language, even the same dialect, Latin American Spanish. So accent is just way, way broad. Like anytime someone speaks differently for whatever reason, you can call that an accent, whether it's from their dialect or their location or their language or their nationality, any of that.
So Madeline is saying something about this. She says, I believe dialect is more the specific words and phrases, etc., used in a certain region. Would you agree with that? So, I mean, I can think of, if you go up north and you have what do they call it? Geordie accent.
Right.
There's certain things they might say. I can't off the top of my head remember. But yeah, there's certain things, certain words and phrases that they say that are combinations of other things. Is that dialect? Is Geordie a dialect? And the other what was the one in London? East Cockney. Cockney, yeah. Is that a dialect?
So, I mean, I wouldn't be able to speak specifically to those individual ones. Mandolin is very correct about it's more about words and phrases, but it can include pronunciation. Or even what contractions you use. So, I mean, it's easy to say that's an accent because it sounds different. Anything that's going to sound different is going to be an accent. Dialect is a little bit more particular, but yes, there's also other layers of this. There can be a vernacular, for instance, like different areas can have different slang. That doesn't make it a dialect.
Right.
Dialect means it has some traits of a language that are separate. So I wouldn't be able to specifically say, for instance, what dialects are different within British English, for instance, though a better example would be like the different dialects of English in the Caribbean. Jamaican English is obviously its own dialect. It has different pronunciation, it has different phrases, it has different vocabulary, it has different ways they deal with contractions and all of these things. It's very clearly a different dialect, but it's not a language. It's not a different language. It is still a dialect of English. In the same way that Latin American, the main differences between Latin American and Spanish, and Castilian Spanish are not even... there are some pronunciation differences, but the biggest differences are really grammatical, like in terms of what grammar tenses are used and which grammar tenses are not used. That's a really good example of a dialect. So see, the dialect might include pronunciation differences, but it has to have more than that. For instance, grammar changes or vocabulary changes, right?
So Susanna's got a comment which ties in with this, I think. She says, some people get a British accent and some American. So what's the method to acquire a particular accent? Is it shadowing?
So intentionally? Oh,
yeah, sorry, presumably, yeah. She says, is it shadowing and repeating or any other method? So presumably, Susanna, you're talking about if you wanted to deliberately acquire more British English or American English.
Because most of the time it's unintentional, like whatever, like you can tell usually someone who learned English in school, if they went to a British school, they speak with more of a British accent, more, like not usually perfectly, but closer. And if they went to an American school, they speak more with an American accent.
Yeah, I think so. It just depends on the source of your learning.
Yes.
So if you have an American teacher, they're going to teach you American English. And if you have a British teacher, they'll teach you British English. Which is why I think we are so lucky here at the English Language Club to have an American and a British teacher. And because, I think of English as an international language.
Yes.
But also, it's not just who your teachers. It's also things like movies and TV shows and music, which is a place where people get a lot of their learning comes from that. And I know... And if you do learn from movies, then most movies are American, so you're probably going to have a bit more of an American accent. So I know a lot of people who, even if they sort of learn from British teachers, they still have a bit of an American accent because they're so more exposed to American media and TV movies and music.
Yes. In fact, it's somewhat rare now for people who learned English, not in the UK itself, to have, a kind of a pure British accent to what they learned because of the influence of American media. Like a lot of people will wind up with some pronunciation things that come more from an American accent that they picked up from songs or things like this, even if they went to a British school in Asia or something.
But going back to what we said before, like about trying to adopt a particular accent, I don't think that should be the goal of people learning English, unless there's a particular reason. There's nothing wrong with doing that if you particularly...
You're trying to become a journalist or something like that.
Yeah, if you particularly want to. But generally speaking, you should be aiming just to have correct pronunciation and correct grammar and as wide a vocabulary as possible. If you can speak English with whatever accent, and that's fine. Is that what you're getting at, Susanna? Let us know. So,
and I think one thing to keep in mind is that, especially when it comes to pronunciation of words, pronunciation of sounds is very important. Unfortunately, we have the great resource of the English Language Club videos on pronunciation of sounds.
And the
it's
app?
very clear,
Don't
and
forget
it's
about
not.
the
And
app?
the app, yes, don't forget the app. You can get it on the Android, like on Play Store, I think.
Yeah.
That can help you pronounce sounds correctly, and that's really important. But when it comes to pronouncing words, there is never, for virtually any word, a universal, always right way of pronouncing that word. Sure, there is the, for instance, like there's an official dictionary pronunciation of words, but depending on where you are, people are going to, not incorrectly, like that's the way they're supposed to be pronouncing it, they will pronounce that word differently sometimes. Mandolin, way back at the beginning, asked a question we didn't get to about the caught merger and father bother merger. So there's this idea that you can kind of trace accents in different places by specific words, pairs of words, whether they pronounce them the same or differently. Caught as in like a temporary bed, C-O-T, or caught like as in I caught a fish, C-A-U-G-H-T. Some people pronounce them the same. I think I pronounce them slightly differently. I say a cot as in a bed, and I caught more with an aw with a W, but some people will pronounce the same. Caught.
Here's a quick fun game. How would you say? What is the word for the sister of your mother?
Ah, yes, my aunt, my.
But that's not how you would say it, right? I'm sure you would say aunt.
Well, it depends. But yes.
To me, an ant is a little creature, a little insect.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so that's another one. And the other one that Mandolin brought up is how do you pronounce father? Do you is it more of an father or more of an father?
For me, it's father.
Yes,
and it's
and
at
so,
the end.
What Mandolin is bringing up, and I don't think we necessarily have time to talk about this in great detail right now, but there's the way these words are pronounced is actually different. Like what's correct is different in different places in the world, not just Britain versus the UK. I mean, this is the father bother or caught sounds are often talked about, for instance, in between the north or the south of the US or the north or the south of England. And so, to me, and there's a lot to there's some really interesting, like we talked about assimilation maybe last week or was it the week before, and there's some really interesting history to this. But what I think the important thing to understand about this, if you're learning English, is that people pronounce words differently. You shouldn't be afraid too much that you're somehow not pronouncing the word like exactly the right way. Obviously, this is a goal that you want to work towards, pronouncing words correctly, but depending on where you go, people will pronounce words differently. And so you can't always be, you can't beat yourself up about that. You can't be too worried about pronouncing it wrong because you might just go over to the next county and suddenly they pronounce it differently. Yeah. The other side of this is, the idea about this merger that Mandolin is bringing up is that people, depending on where they grew up, they can't hear the difference between certain sounds. And so this is important. It's not just in how we talk, it's in how we hear.
Yeah.
And so, again, this is something that native English speakers, depending on where they are, there are certain sounds that they just don't learn how to say or that they don't learn how to hear. So this is not, like, trying to pronounce words correctly is not a problem that only English learners have. Even native speakers have this problem when they travel. People, when they're talking to people who aren't from the same place as they are. So I hope that's encouraging. Someone else asked the question, Mohit asked, how do you know how the word is actually pronounced? And the answer is always the dictionary. The dictionary should have, and most online dictionaries have the pronunciation, and they have a little thing that you can click on to hear it. But that's by itself is not necessarily going to be enough for everyone. I, for instance, have a hard time learning to pronounce a word just by hearing it. So a dictionary will also have the letters in the IPA.
Yeah, the
They'll
transcription.
have a symbol for each different sound, and then you can look up that symbol. and practice making that sound, especially like, again, the English Language Club app and the English Language Club YouTube channel has lots, like Colin has made some really good resources.
I've made a video on every one of the sounds in the IPA, and it talks a little bit about, I model every sound, and I talk a little bit about, where your tongue should be, and the important factors of each of the sounds, where your tongue should be, how your lips should be shaped, and where the sound's coming from, and things like that. So if you're familiar with those, and then you see the phonetic transcription, then you know kind of how it should feel to say the sound, as well as and how and what you physically need to be doing, because those are important, because that's how we make the sound. If it doesn't feel right, it's probably not going to sound right.
And it's about practice. Yeah. And this is going back to what we were talking about with Ishraq about speaking Arabic, like English speakers trying to learn Arabic. The only way you can learn to pronounce those sounds that don't exist in your language is by practicing them. And if the sound is slightly different in your language from the language you're learning, if you don't practice that new way, every time you try to say that sound, your mouth is always going to go to the way you know how to say it.
Yeah.
It's the same as any exercise.
A good example of that is when people who have Spanish as a first language, because they're not accustomed to sticking their tongue out when they say they instead of or the th sound, they often say d instead of the, the tree instead of the tree, or whatever. And it's because they're trying to make that, they hear the, and they try to make that sound without physically doing the right thing, and it comes out duh.
So just like if you're practicing typing, or you're practicing running, or you're practicing doing sit-ups, or you're shooting hoops in basketball, you have to practice these motions for your body to be comfortable doing them. Because if your body isn't comfortable doing these motions, to make a sound with your tongue stuck out, or make an R with your tongue curled back, like if your body isn't used to making these motions, then when it comes time to make the sound, it will be awkward, and it won't happen smoothly. But once you have all of these sounds, just like once you learn an alphabet and you know all the sounds, then you should be able to look at any word and figure out how it's pronounced. Now, obviously in English, that's much more difficult than it sounds. But the same thing is going to be true for pronunciation. If you know how to make the sounds and you realize that you're pronouncing a word wrong, you can switch, because your body already knows how to make all those sounds. So you switch which sound you're making, and it will sound better. And it's really, really important. And we can't stress this enough. Learning to pronounce the sounds physically, how you move your mouth, where you put your tongue, whether or not you use your vocal cords, all of these things just will make the smoothness and therefore the confidence with which you speak English so much better.
Yeah. Now, there's a great question here which ties in a lot with that. Fiorella says, I love the video where the phonetic chart is explained. And actually, I'm trying to learn it by heart. Do you think all EFL students need to know this, or is it just optional? And Mandolin also says, I'm also learning the phonetic alphabet. So my opinion on that is that no, not all EFL students need to know this. I'm sure there are lots of people out there who speak excellent English as a second language, and they learned without ever looking at the phonetic chart. In fact, I know a couple. I know someone who she came to England. I met her when she came to England to study English, but she already spoke pretty good English, and she said that when she was in a class here in England, she started to see the phonetic transcription occasionally in the textbooks, and she didn't have a clue what it was. She'd never looked at that she's from Brazil. She'd never looked at that in Brazil. So it's possible to learn without it, but depending on where you're from, what your first language is, you may find it more helpful, you may find it less helpful. So it's a tool. It's a tool. It's a tool, and if you find it useful, use it. If you don't, then don't. There's nothing wrong with not knowing it. But
it can be a very useful tool.
Knowing how to correctly pronounce the schwa symbol, the schwa sound, as people call it, but it's not really the schwa sound. it's not part of being able to speak English correctly and being able to communicate correctly. If you ask most native speakers in English, they're not going to know what a schwa sound is or how to pronounce.
They won't know the symbol.
Yeah, they won't know the
That's
symbol.
just an upside down E. What's wrong with that E?
Yeah, well, what's the ash? What's the ash symbol?
Oh, yeah. Well, nowadays a lot of people know that, but only in the last few weeks.
Because of Elon Musk.
Yes.
Yeah. Elon Musk's new baby has the ash symbol, but and when he announced his baby's name, the views on that video shot through the roof. So some of you may have discovered this channel because of that. So if that's you, then you're very welcome here. But actually, the way that it's pronounced in his baby's name is not how it's pronounced in the IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet. So, a lot of those symbols are stolen from other languages, and they're used in different ways. They represent sounds in IPA that they don't represent in the language that they come from.
Right. So I mean, for instance, the ash sound comes from ancient Latin, and in ancient Latin, it's pronounced
the sound
I.
or the symbol. The symbol, right?
Well, the symbol. Yeah, the symbol. That symbol that is it comes from Latin, and in Latin, it's pronounced I.
Right.
Which is not at all how it's pronounced in IPA.
In IPA, it's
Yes.
Yeah.
But the same thing happens with our letters. The letter J in English, in most English pronunciations, is pronounced with a J sound. But the letter J comes from the sound Y, like that we use a Y for in English. So I mean, alphabets have been stealing letters from each other since the beginning of alphabets. So it happens. It's interesting. It's part of the history. But so going back to whether you really need to learn the IPA, learning the sounds and practicing the sounds is very useful, very important. Yes, you don't. I mean, especially if you're a person who learns well just by hearing, you don't always need to use it. But to me, I highly, highly recommend that tool. Now, whether you need to learn the symbols, that's up to you, because it does make it very easy to look up a word in the dictionary and know immediately how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
But learning the sounds is extremely important.
Because I said no, you don't need to learn it. But what I should go into that. If you've got, it's a tool for helping with pronunciation. So if you've got any problems with pronunciation, then it's a tool you should use. So in that sense, yes. But no, you don't need to memorize every symbol. You don't need to be able to read phonetic transcript. If you had a big piece of text all in phonetic transcript, you wouldn't need to be able to read that.
Do you have the mug with you?
I don't, unfortunately.
Okay, right.
I'll use that one next week. I was using my prepositions one this week.
Yes.
But next week I'll use the phonetic transcription one. It's a tool, but also you can use each individual phoneme as a tool, and you can just focus on the ones that you or use it to identify the sounds that you're having problems with.
Yes.
So, yes and no is the answer to the question. Does everyone need to learn?
It's a useful tool.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Susanta pointed out that we got past 20 likes today.
Oh, right, yes.
So
great.
Congratulations and thank you, everyone.
But if you haven't liked the video so far, then please do. If you are learning English and you want to improve your English, then if you click the like button, then YouTube is more likely to let you know when we put more videos out and when we do more live streams. So you'll be able to find us more easily. So, keep the likes coming. That's great. So let's see. Where did we get to? Ishrak says, what about the IELTS speaking test? Can you explain a bit about it, please? Because I'm studying it online from an Australian university. You mean IELTS? I think you mean IELTS, International English Language Testing System. So if I remember correctly, off the top of my head, I can't remember. But I think if I remember correctly, you're given. It'll say something like, tell tell me about a member of your family who's had an influence on you, or the question will be something like that, and you'll then get sort of maybe 30 seconds to think about it, and then you have to speak for about 90 seconds. I think that's how the test works. So, yeah, I mean, my only tip, a really good tip is to practice. You know, even though you're not really practicing English, you're just you're practicing the format of that test.
Yes.
So
practicing answering questions, really. Yeah.
But in that particular way, you need to be able
format.
to plan out. You've got that 30 seconds to kind of think, and you can kind of treat it like an essay. What's your beginning, what's your middle, what's your end, and then you need to. It's really good to practice speaking for that length of time. That specific length of time that you need to speak for, because even if you just gave to any native speaker, you gave them that, they're gonna benefit from practice, and even if their English is perfect, just the timing of it and things like that. So I would say practice. You can easily do a quick Google search and find loads of example questions, and but you're practicing speaking for 90 seconds. So that you know what that feels like, what you can plan out, the kind of number of things you need to say to make it last the right amount of time, and things like that. So that would be my main tip for that. Hopefully in the future we can do a lot more on exam preparation. I think we're writing a grammar course at the moment, so that will be out within the next couple of months, and then we'll be making a lot of free grammar videos to talk about the course as well. But then after that, I think I'd love to do an IELTS preparation course, or Cambridge certificate preparation course, something like that. So yeah, good question. Fiorella is talking about the th sound and getting it confused with s and f. Okay. Well, it's been an hour and 20 minutes now, so it's been quite a long one. It's weird, the time always just flies by when we do these live streams.
It does, yes. Yeah. You guys are all such great such a great audience. We always have such good questions, such interesting questions to talk about.
But Tony, also it's because you are so knowledgeable and a great speaker. I can hardly get a word in edgeways sometimes.
I'm sorry.
No, but that's great. It's great because
you're
you're a lot smarter than me. If it was just me doing these, then I'd have a lot more trouble answering most of these questions. So yes, we're all very lucky to have you, Tony. And
I'm lucky to be here.
And we're all lucky to have you guys watching with such great questions. We are going to try and aim to do this every week at the same time on a Tuesday. That's 2 p.m. in the UK. So if you know anyone who would benefit from watching, please let them know, and make sure you come back next week. And come with like I said, with any questions. These I've started calling these live streams Club Hangout. So we're coming with no real agenda. We may have a few ideas of things to talk about, but really what we want to do is talk about the things that answer the questions that you have. So come with questions, and we'll continue to have a really great time. So keep those likes coming, even though the video is ending now. If you're watching all the way to the end, then you must like the video. And I'm sure most people are subscribed, or you wouldn't have found the video. But if you're not subscribed, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And we'll see you next week.
Yes.
Bye-bye for now.